This is the Reason Interview with Nick Gillespie. Please rate and review and subscribe to this podcast at Reason.com, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you're finding it. And share it with people you think might find it interesting. So, the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of 1991, taking down with it the threat of international communism, right? My guest today says no, writing, "Far from dead, communism as a governing template seems only to be getting started." He's Sean McMeekin, a historian at Bard College and author of the mesmerizing new book, To Overthrow the World, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Communism. I talk with him about the history of communism, how its focus on forced equality is inherently violent, and how Stalin, Mao, Castro, and others each brought particular flourishes and horrors to its practice. We also talk about why McMeekin believes that the control and suppression of speech during COVID and the rise of social media oligarchies in America bear uncomfortable resemblances to China's social credit system. We dodged a certain bullet with the election of Trump, he says, warning that whatever party is in power in Washington, I think we always have to jealously guard our civil liberties, and we have to just constantly remind ourselves of what our values are and are supposed to be. Here is the Reason Interview with Sean McMeekin. Sean McMeekin, thanks for talking to Reason.
Well, thanks for having me on, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here.
So the book is To Overthrow the World, and it's the rise and fall and rise of communism. And we'll get to that second rise of communism in a bit. But I mean, that's in a way, your book summarizes the movement of communism as an intellectual and as a political or military force in world history. And then you end with this. Your final line reads, "Far from dead, communism as a governing template seems only to be getting started," which is haunting, and we'll get to that. But that's kind of like, I guess this is like Sunset Boulevard or something. We're starting with a body floating in a swimming pool, and then we're going to do the backstory, and then we'll come back to that because that's kind of amazing to suggest. But could you explain, starting with Marx particularly, what is the essence of communism, and why did it grow in kind of strength and appeal throughout the 19th century heading into the 20th century?
Well, I suppose Marx is a good place to begin. I don't begin literally with Marx in the book. Of course, I go back a little bit further, but Marx is certainly the thinker who kind of put the biggest imprint on what we would call the history of communism. It really introduced the concept and the term with the Manifesto of the Communist Party in 1848. Unlike earlier socialists or thinkers on the left, who had obviously been critical of social inequality, or unlike, you might say, certain Christian prophets and saints, who had advised that people renounce wealth. Marx
started with Jesus himself, right?
Well, sure, starting with Jesus.
Yeah.
I mean, it is something of a heresy, really, in the history of Christianity. And I mean, Marx wasn't necessarily the first. I talk about Etienne Morley, this Enlightenment thinker, really, in the era of Rousseau, but who went even further than Rousseau and began to talk about forcible social equality, even in the sense of rationing and state warehouses where goods would be stored and then distributed equally. Marx was the first to kind of marry this together with a systematic theory, but which also required, almost celebrated, really, political violence. I think that's both. And on the one hand, there have always been people who've been squeamish about this, and they've always thought, oh, well, Marx never really said that.
Yeah.
No, actually, he did. And in fact, I think that was kind of part of the appeal all along.
Where does that come from? Is that, the kind of whitewashing of Marx's interest in political violence? Because that is, I went to college as an undergrad in the 80s, and, so the end was near, but we didn't really know it. But everybody was always like, Marx didn't talk about violence. He talked about the withering away of the state, and then there would be freedom. And it's kind of like, you amply demonstrate, that if communism is built around a kind of belief in social equality that is forced kind of equality, in terms of opportunities, goods and services, outcomes, things like that, it also absolutely relies upon, both theoretically and then in practice, on violence. So when did Marx's interest in violence disappear from the discourse?
Well, I think there's always been this ineffable sense that, look, the true believers, they obviously want to whitewash or ignore this aspect of it, but what they're
Yeah.
looking at is the final goal. They're saying, well, but he said that once the revolution was finally over, well, then we would have peace and class would be abolished and to each according to his needs, and we would all be able to do the proverbial kind of, fish in the morning and read books in the afternoon and have tea in the evening, and we would be living in this kumbaya paradise. But when it came to how you achieve the revolution, Marx was always quite explicit about the violence that was required. I mean, a lot of people have said, well, he never actually had a chance during his lifetime to put it into practice. Well, the closest that it really came in Marx's lifetime to something like a communist revolution was the Paris Commune of
Right.
1871. And there are a lot of people who thought Marx would distance himself from it because it was kind of non-orthodox, it was non-doctrinaire, it was populist. There were certain elements of the communards' policies that were not really strictly Marxist, but were certainly kind of on the left. And it was very violent. And that was another reason a lot of people thought, because Marx being blamed for it. His first Working Man's International Association, founded in 1864, was blamed by the Parisian press and by a lot of the European media for being behind the sanguinary violence of the commune and its suppression. But far from distancing himself from it, Marx kind of doubled down and said, absolutely, yes, it's true. They took these bourgeois hostages and they executed the archbishop and they threw women and children into battle. It was all sanguinary and bloody. Jawohl, he said, that's absolutely what is required. And how dare they accuse us of being violent when, of course, they were the ones who sent troops into battle and killed some of these communards and so on. There was no
And now
escape.
we remember the Communards, if at all, as a 1980s synth pop band. So
I guess that's right.
that's
Yeah.
progress, right?
Yeah, that's progress.
What take us through the 19th century and, like, getting into, I guess, the late 19th and early 20th century, particularly with Lenin. Because and I realize I'm hop skipping and jumping over many things, all of which the book I think what I emailed you to say I wanted to talk to you is the book reads like a novel. It is a weird page turner for the type of book that it is. But to bring it to how, what did Lenin add or adapt to the mix of a kind of Marxist ideal of communism, which is also, then there's a lot of experiments, real and imagined, between Marx and Lenin. But how did Lenin change communism?
Well, I think there were two essential innovations. One is a little bit more well known in What Is to Be Done, or Stodielet, this kind of theoretical work published in 1902. Lenin basically updated the idea that if eventually the integument of private property would sound as Marx had foreseen in Das Kapital, well, he said, look, it's not really happening on its own. And in addition to this, the workers aren't all necessarily on board with either the message or the vision. So effectively, we need this kind of cadre, or cadres, a professional class, sometimes called a vanguard or vanguardism. That is to say, these elite professional revolutionaries were kind of thinking the thoughts for the workers and ushering it along. And for a lot of people, it's seen as kind of a heresy. Luxemburg, Rosa Luxemburg, and other critics said, well, you're against worker democracy and against the spontaneity and the voluntarism of the movement. And I think that was important. But I think more important tactically was what Lenin saw. It was both his reading of history and then also his intervention, you might say, during the First World War. He saw what had happened with the Paris Commune after the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. Basically, France loses a war, so you get a revolution. Happens again in Russia in 1905 in the war against Japan. Russia loses a war, she gets a revolution. It didn't go quite as far as Lenin might have wanted. Then in the First World War, he develops this into something that he calls a theory or a doctrine of revolutionary defeatism, effectively, and he even used scare quotes for one's own country. The idea is you want your country to lose. And going beyond that, he wanted to use the war as a springboard to power, as he put it, turn the imperialist war into a civil war. And then it would beget a whole series of civil wars and then interstate wars. I mean, this is the most shocking thing, is while a lot of people on the left are actually genuinely abhorring the violence of the First World War, Lenin was kind of almost embracing it. He's reading Clausewitz, he's channeling his inner war theorist. And he actually wrote this work in 1916 called The Military Program of the Proletarian Revolution, where what he was basically saying is, yeah, first we're going to, we'll have the weakest kind of link in the chain. Maybe it'll be Russia. They will lose. We'll topple the government there. Then there'll be a civil war there. And then eventually that country will become communist.
Yeah.
Other countries will remain non-communist, and so then that communist country will be at war with them, and eventually you get wars kind of engulfing the entire earth. And he wasn't just saying this as a prophecy; he's saying he's endorsing this. This is what he
Right.
wants, right?
And
Yeah.
you stress that in every iteration, in every major kind of movement towards a communist state, that the people got, or the people pushing for that, the cadres got a massive support from outside of the country. So that, for instance, Lenin's Soviet Union was getting support, or the revolutionary movement was getting support from Germany at the time, that World War I was going on.
Well, that's right. I mean, Lenin was very, shall we say, he was not boasting about this. It was something he was very sensitive about. But we now know, and we have the files, we don't know precisely the mechanisms by which all of the money was transferred in, but we know the Germans appropriated the money. We know they boasted about spending it. We know some of the ways in which it kind of came into the movement. We know that the Bolsheviks were suddenly flush with money after Lenin returned to Petrograd in April 1917. And, they buy up a whole new printing press, cash on the barrelhead. They're flush with money. And then once they were in power, of course, they could use the resources basically of this country that they had kind of conquered and looted, Imperial Russia, and they used those funds, including, of course, everything from gold bullion to jewelry collections and, eventually proper sort of government revenue. They could use this then to subvene and sponsor revolution abroad. And they systematized this as something they called the Communist International. Various ironies abound that the currency in which all the accounts were kept was actually the US dollar. And the language of the Comintern or Communist International was German. But of course, the whole thing was run from Moscow. And so it was essentially funded and financed by Moscow. And this was made clear in the so-called 21 conditions of membership, that the membership, the member parties, they called of such and such country, the Communist Party of France, Germany, etc. They all received funding from Moscow. And it's true of the American Communist Party, for example, right up to the end of the 1980s. They're still paying the colossal rent on their headquarters in New York. Based
Gus Hall. Gus
yeah,
Hall had quite a sinecure, right, from the Soviet Union.
that's right.
One of the other things that you talk about is how within the Soviet Union, within Soviet Russia, there obviously was a political orthodoxy and there was a theory behind it. But then very quickly, as things changed, Lenin, moving off of war communism, then starts new economic planning, and which actually introduced limited forms of kind of like micro markets and things like that. Why did he do that, or why did the Soviets do that? And how was that received by the people? Were they happy for that, or were they, were true believers like, I can't believe this is happening? Or, I mean, just, one of the things that people always talk about, communism fails because it is hyper idealistic, but the Soviet Union certainly shows in its early stages it was ruthlessly pragmatic, on a day-to-day basis.
Well, sure. I mean, it was reluctant. I think that's the first thing to say. It was not something that Lenin wanted to have to do. Effectively, the entire economy had collapsed by early 1921. In particular, there was this massive famine engulfing the Black Earth region of Russia, engulfing Ukraine, engulfing Central Asia. Eventually, along with the economic collapse in the cities, the collapse of manufacturing, the collapse of industry, the collapse in the energy sector, particularly down in the Transcaucasus around Baku, you had this thoroughgoing economic collapse, as high as 80 and 90% in certain sectors dating back to 1917. It was effectively a kind of admission of defeat. And in fact, at times they were even, I mean, somewhat to his credit, despite being quite monstrous in other ways, Lenin actually was quite blunt and upfront about this, saying, well, I guess we realized we didn't really know how to run businesses or, how to extract oil and how to build things. And so they started hiring back kind of managers and even experts they would hire to appraise jewelry and treasures. They would hire foreign managers, many Germans, many Americans. And for a while they had to tolerate this. And they basically told the communists, look, you just have to kind of suck up your gut and your pride and you have to learn. You have to learn how to do business. And they even talked openly about this. You have to learn from the capitalists how to do business. And the capitalists, the new economic policy, Novaya Ekonomiska Politika, oddly enough, the acronym was the same in English and Russian, and they even used a kind of semi-anglicized slang phrase, Nepmen, the Nepmen, And curiously enough, although I didn't live through the 1920s, I lived through the 1990s in Moscow, and you had a very similar kind of a phenomenon with, these garish new businessmen with, kind of like two malls on both arms with their mink coats and all this. And you began seeing that in places like Moscow and Petersburg, now Leningrad, in the 1920s, with all these vast new fortunes being made. But it was always tense, and the crackdowns would occur periodically. There was always this tension because the regime kind of knew it needed these people, because otherwise the economy would collapse and everyone would starve. On the other hand, you couldn't really celebrate them, and so there'd be crackdowns. So there was a crackdown in the winter of 23-24. There was even more violent crackdown, of course, in 1928 when Stalin launched, although it was kind of backdated from 29, the 5-year plan. The thing that actually gave birth to what we now call the Gulag was actually a crackdown on the NEP men. Nearly 3 million of them were sent to forced labor camps. On the one hand, the regime sort of gave them, they encouraged them to go ahead and start rebuilding the economy. And then once they made fortunes, then the regime cracked down on them. So there was a real kind of a Janus-faced attitude towards capitalism. But the problem was they could never entirely eradicate whether it was tolerated as the black market, or tolerated as kind of this limited new economic policy involving the relegalization. The regime could never entirely do without this black market, in the same way later on they had to tolerate kind of private agricultural plots and people's kind of dacha plots, because otherwise everyone would have starved. It was impossible to plan economic activity down to the
And you see echoes of that in places like Cuba, which at various points in its history has like loosened things up to allow
right.
limited forms of capitalism. But then if it goes too far, et cetera. Would you talk a bit about the how what was the American kind of interactions, or what were the most meaningful interactions, say in the 20s, and particularly after Stalin takes over, moving into the 30s? There was an American left, there was, an American Communist Party, but what was their attitude towards the Soviet Union? There are, I guess it was Lincoln Steffens, right, who's the journalist who said, "I've seen the future and it works."
Mhm. Yeah.
And there were the John Reeds of the world and all of this, but you know, how did progressive, and I guess capital P progressive populists in America, were they looking at the Soviet Union and saying, "Oh, these guys have it right," or were they seeing that as a distinctly kind of European weirdness that should be avoided?
No, I think a lot of American progressives, not just the out and out communists, but some of the so-called fellow travelers, looked to the Soviet Union like Lincoln Steffens, and yes, the future is there. A lot of them actually went there in search of employment in the 1930s. There's a fascinating book about African Americans in particular. It's true, we had the Depression here, so a lot of people are out of work, and there was this promise of full employment. Effectively, you have a state which, at least in theory, everyone is working, in part because Marx had talked about the equal liability of all to labor, and there's actually, believe it or not, codified in Soviet law, universal labor obligation. Effectively, the dark side of that, of course, was forced labor, and they had forced labor camps, slave labor all over the place. On the other hand, theoretically, yes, they had full employment. And so I think a lot of people really did believe in this promise. Some of them were journalists, or maybe a little bit naive, who would be taken on those kind of conducted tours that the Soviet Union specialized in, the so-called Potemkin or Potemkin village effect, some of which was kind of an old Russian practice dating back to Tsarist times, of kind of pulling the wool over people's eyes and letting them see what they wanted to see. But I think in some ways, even more important than the role, eventually this climate of opinion did help to influence foreign policy in Washington, and I do talk about that in the book. But in some ways, oddly enough, I think it's actually the American business community that may have played an even larger role, really, in the kind of the building of communism, in part because, again, in the same way that the NEP men, they had to allow these private entrepreneurs to flourish, they had to hire a lot of managers and a lot of engineers. And so a lot of the blast furnaces, metallurgical facilities, and even kind of vast manufacturing plants built in the Soviet Union, even things like smelting plants or hydroelectric dams, were actually designed by or modeled on American. Even the famous kolkhoz, or collective farm, was modeled on the operation of Thomas Campbell, the wheat king of Montana, basically because he just had the world's largest farm. And the Soviets were always big. Gigantism was a huge part of the kind of cult of the economy in the Soviet Union. They always had to build the world's largest this and the world's largest that. So they
Where
loved the
where does
fact.
that come from?
Mhm.
Because and that sounds oddly contemporary. We have a president elect, as we're as we're recording this, he'll be, I think this will come out after Trump is starting his second term, but he is a fan of gigantism in everything. He's always talking about bigger things. Elon Musk is a
Mm.
giganticist. What was the appeal? What was the appeal in the 1930s to this idea that we are going to build the world's biggest everything?
I suppose you could say on the one hand, it's something of an inferiority complex. I mean, when Stalin's talking about, we have to catch up and surpass the West, we have to channel 50 years of industrial development into 10 years, or later on when it's Mao and Khrushchev talking about how they're going to catch up and surpass, and we will bury you. Oddly enough, he was actually kind of talking mostly about things like meat and milk production when he said that. The gigantism of the Stalin era, particularly in the 30s, I think the idea was, and you can't totally blame him for this. This is an era when everyone was, they remember the First World War. A lot of people were kind of dreading, but also kind of anticipating that there'd be another war. And so the idea is, we have to build, the greatest plants. We have to build the largest and the biggest and the best tanks. I mean, eventually you get to the point where in the latter days of the Soviet Union, they're even building the world's largest hotels. I
Right.
happened to spend some time once at the Hotel Cosmos. I mean, this hideous cement monstrosity, something like 35,000 rooms. And I don't know
Yeah.
why you would want to have a hotel with 35,000 rooms. But no, dating back to the 20s and 30s, again, this is the idea. Magnitogorsk, Kotkin wrote a great book about this called Magnetic Mountain. Effectively, they're trying to build sort of the world's largest steel plant, an entire steel town with a population of 250,000 people. Curiously enough, it was actually modeled on the steel plant in Gary, Indiana, of all places. They hired the Arthur McKee Corporation of Cleveland, Ohio, to build it. So they were
Well,
hiring the best, the latest, the American
yeah.
capitalists to build the greatest communist
And
kind of
and this is
plants.
partly also, I mean, this is true today with firms like Halliburton and a bunch of others, where they're,
Mhm.
they're really at any given point in time, there's only a handful of companies that can build that kind of infrastructure at any point in time.
No, I suppose that's true,
Yeah.
and they wanted the kind of the biggest and the best, in part because again there's this idea of communism. This is a phrase that Martin Malia, an advisor of mine at Berkeley, used to talk about. He talked about it as something of a theory of overcoming backwardness. This whole idea that, look, we're behind the West now, but communists, we will eventually surpass them. And so to do so, you had to plan things. It all had to be much larger on a grander scale. So you'd have these grandiose production targets: 50,000 tractors blowing up the capitalist world, 50,000 tanks, 25,000 warplanes. So you'd have these gargantuan production targets. Now they would almost always fall short, of course, and that was the problem. Is then that you had to have someone to blame, and so that's where you would get the show trials and the wreckers and the scapegoats, and eventually, of course, the Great Terror, among other things. You were always falling short of these ambitious goals of kind of surpassing the West and beating it at its own game. But the idea was, again, to surpass them. Mhm.
Did Stalin, did he represent? I'm thinking back again to my undergraduate days, and also my graduate years coincided with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of communism in literature programs, and it was fascinating because people literally overnight went from being very interested into politics to claiming I've never been interested in world
Mm,
events. Because most of the students were I very few of them were Marxist, but most of them seemed to prefer the Soviet Union or
mm.
red to blue America, as it was, I guess, considered at that time. But did one of the things that used to come up a lot is that, well, the problem was that Lenin, that Trotsky lost out of the power struggle. And if Trotsky had succeeded Lenin, everything would have been great. And Stalin was vastly different theoretically and practically than Lenin. Is this true? Or in what ways does it perhaps not matter as much as people who want to say the Soviet Union was a morally upright country or government rather, just want to believe that for their own cause.
Yeah, I suppose we could call this the old good Lenin, bad Stalin canard, or I suppose you'd add it to Trotsky. What's curious about this, and I'll get to some of the subtle differences between the personalities in a moment. But if you talk to Russians today, or really even going back a couple of decades in Russia, but it's particularly true today, What's remarkable is that Lenin has been completely jettisoned, even by some who
Hmm.
were, still somewhat chauvinistic. Talk about Putin himself, for example, with his kind of vision of this kind of authoritarian pride in Russia's achievements. Now, it's not that Putin is completely uncritical about Stalin and his legacy. They do know about some of the crimes and so on, but rather Stalin is revered today and Lenin is reviled because Stalin was effectively a conqueror and an empire builder, whereas Lenin was a destroyer. Lenin destroyed the Russian Empire. He kind of tore it down root and branch, went to war with the church in an absolutely vicious way, and absolutely destroyed traditional Russian society. And so Russia's today, and maybe some of it is you might call it a slightly exaggerated or try too hard version of rediscovering the Orthodox Christianity. So Lenin is kind of, the Orthodox villain. That's a different way than I think most Westerners view things. I think, yes, there's definitely this sense, and I suppose Stephen Cohen of Princeton, with his work on Bukharin. I mean, in some ways, Bukharin, the so-called Bukharin alternative that he talked about, and I'm sympathetic to Cohen as a historian. I thought, he had a lot right. I don't necessarily buy the idea of a Bukharin alternative, but I think his work on the new economic policy era and on Bukharin is definitely worth reading. The interesting factor there is the idea that because Lenin had at least seen the light a little bit about the excesses of war communism by 1921, they had to retreat, as we were talking about the new economic policy. True, they had sworn sort of death to the kulaks and all the rest of it as
Hmm.
well. But then Lenin backed down a little bit and allowed that maybe we would have to allow the economy to recover. And then Bukharin's idea was, well, sure, maybe we could grow into socialism or socialism in one country, as they called it, by allowing more of the peasants to kind of allow a primitive capital accumulation. And eventually maybe the state collectives would get a little better at producing consumer goods. And wasn't quite sure how it would work in practice. But the idea is you had to let it go for a long time. Lenin even at times implied before he died in 1924, although he was kind of already pretty much out of commission by 23, he had implied that it might take a decade or more, that is, of relenting and allowing the new economic policy. So that's maybe a slightly more plausible alternative, the idea that had they allowed the new economic policy to run a little bit further. The problem was already by 1926-27, the peasant, not just the output, but literally the contributions to the state collectors were drying up just because there was nothing to buy. I think Stalin made, in some ways, the only really realistic political move, which is to go back on the offensive just because the peasants were no longer cooperating. Trotsky, though, I've always found this really bizarre. And I mean, I used to know, and I had fun debating a lot of Trotskyists. I think they're fewer than they used to be. You still saw a lot of them kind of in the 80s and the 90s. I think fewer now than then. But what was great about the Trotskyists, I used to have these debates with them, and I would kind of point out, again, it was not that Trotsky was less radical than Stalin; he was actually more radical than Stalin. I mean, Trotsky's whole vision was kind of permanent revolution, now and forever, everywhere. Go on the offensive. He didn't want the new economic policy to continue. He wanted to go right back to this socialist or communist offensive, central planning targets, and maybe he was a little bit more cultivated as a personality in some ways than Stalin, although Stalin was actually very well read. He was something of an intellectual too. We shouldn't forget, of course, Trotsky in the course of the Civil War not only introduced concentration camps and the death penalty and committed all kinds of atrocities, he personally oversaw the crushing of the Kronstadt rebellion in 1921. Women and children should be shot like partridges, sending people off to labor camps in the Soviet Arctic and the far north. He was someone who was absolutely not squeamish about inflicting political violence on
Right.
people. This is one of the reasons why I actually use, again, maybe there's like a softer sympathizer who kind of has a naive attitude about Trotsky. I used to encounter Trotskyists who were quite upfront about all this. They would just tell me, absolutely right. Those mutineers deserve to be killed. That
Right.
this was the only way forward.
Do you
That
think the
Trotsky.
appeal of him to, Americans in the late communist or immediate post-communist era was partly that push towards permanent revolution?
I think so, and to be really honest, again, the more genuine and honest Trotskyists, maybe more so than, let's say, those who buy into the kind of the Che Guevara cult. Che Guevara was kind of one of Castro's chief executioners. I think the more well-informed admirers actually do understand that political violence was a big part of it. And in fact, that's even part of the attraction for them. Yes, there are others, who I think are more naive about this. But yes, I mean, the other thing is it's a more inspiring vision. I mean, Bukharin, I think part of the reason he lost, and part of the reason why, again, while I was sympathetic to the Stephen Cohen kind of book and his perspective, I mean, obviously what happened under Stalin was monstrous, and it would have been great if something else had happened in the Soviet Union. But that said, politically, it was just kind of implausible. How can you get inspired by a vision of, let's just kind of waddle along for a while and allow pseudo capitalism to flourish and tolerate it, even though we're communists? It's not very inspiring to communists who are believing in, making a better world and building a new world. In the end, Stalin, and the other thing is, we talk about the late 80s. This is true even in the 30s. Again, if you look at the heyday of fellow traveling. This is actually Trotsky's phrase, the poputchiki, or the fellow travelers, the ones who might not have been Communist Party members, but who were kind of really useful to the movement because, they're writing, kind of pains to the achievements of the Soviet Union, this sort of thing. The heyday of fellow traveling, and even the heyday of people joining Communist Front committees in the Communist Party, was not under the new economic policy of the 1920s. It was in the 30s. It was in high Stalinism. It was in the period really of some of the most colossal crimes committed, from the kind of the Holodomor in Ukraine that we now talk about, to the launching of the Great Terror, the extension of the death penalty to children as young as 12 years old. That was the period when the kind of the prestige of communism was at its height, and when most people were joining Communist Front committees.
Is
And yes,
that
some of it was because of the whole Hitler and Nazi Germany, and we think
right?
they're a bulwark thing. But you can't completely ignore the fact that it was also the period when they were supposedly building things, and they had full employment, and
Right.
they're building communism. That was more inspiring than the kind of muddling along period of the 20s under new economic
Yeah.
policy.
Did with how badly did the Russian Nazi alliance? I mean, that there were breakpoints, right? Because there's the show trials becoming more public, or the Spanish Civil War, the show trials, and and the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, the non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. By the end of that period, had communism in the United States, or a love of the Soviet Union, had it mostly dissipated?
Well, it's an interesting question. You can certainly see it and you can measure it as far as the impact of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact membership in the U.S. Communist Party after peaking. I believe 1938 actually did start to decline again. A country like France, I mean, it was even more visceral, of course. I mean, when the communists are literally in the middle of the German invasion of France and the Low Countries in May and June of 1940, the communists are advising collaboration with the invading Nazis. And again, you can't say all communists went along with this. Obviously, a lot of them ripped up their party membership cards to discuss. Not all of them. A lot of communists were actually arrested for sedition, espionage, or collaboration. Later on, they supposedly were the heroes of the resistance, but we shouldn't forget that when the invasion was actually happening, communists in France were actually advising French men and women to collaborate with the invader. And that obviously did serious damage to kind of the prestige and reputation of communism. And even with the kind of the spying, I mean, some of the most famous Soviet spies in Washington, for example, Harry Dexter White, it's not that he breaks entirely. It's just he just kind of disappears for a while. But somebody like Whittaker Chambers, it's for him, it's kind of the last straw, even though maybe he was already a little bit disillusioned by then. It definitely had an impact, although it kind of flips around, of course, after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. And suddenly, then, oh, well, now that we're against Hitler, then suddenly the communists win back a lot of that kind of.
My the most fascinating turnaround, and I've been thinking about this a lot because of the recent Bob Dylan biopic, A Complete Unknown, where Pete Seeger is kind of the villain of that movie, but Seeger, as a member of a group called the New Almanac Singers, uh, released an album called Songs for John Doe, which was after the pact had been signed, and it's filled with songs criticizing Franklin Roosevelt, and asking to make sure that we don't enter that European war, etc., because the Soviets and the Nazis were now on the same team. And then the minute that Germany invaded the Soviet Union, they pulled the record. It had been released only for a few weeks or a few months. They tried to pull all the copies, and they released a new record that was about how we need to be interventionists at this point on the helping the Soviets. And I guess Dalton Trumbo also did something similar, having written Johnny Got His Gun, which is
Mhm.
yeah, arguably the greatest pacifist novel, certainly written by an American in the early 20th century. And it was written by most accounts at the, if not direct instruction, but the prodding of the Comintern to, keep Americans isolationist during World War II, or as the European War was starting. And then he came up with the incredible Andrew afterwards, kind of pushing people to join the European theater of war. So that kind of turnaround is fascinating to think about from a literary and cultural point of view.
Yeah, I mean, communists, if they were loyal, would be forced often to turn on a dime. And it wasn't just Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I mean, another example that I allude to briefly in the book regarding Roosevelt was even earlier. That is to say that until the Popular Front was made the official as collaboration of the left parties against the fascist or Nazi threat was made the official policy of the Communist International in July 1935. Roosevelt was absolutely supposed to be denounced as a sort of a social fascist warmonger, etc. And then they got instructions they didn't have to denounce Roosevelt, at least not quite as viciously or vociferously. It was true in the late days of Weimar Germany, another famous example when the Nazis were actually seen as less of a threat than the Social Democrats in Germany, and so they were supposed to denounce the social fascists as the true threats. Again, to us today, it's kind of amazing that people who go through these contortions to follow the latest iteration of the party line, but then these are loyal communists. Somebody like Pete Seeger. I mean, sure, he's also a great folk singer, but he was absolutely a communist. And the thing is, if you believed in the vision, I suppose you were willing to swallow this sort of thing. I mean, again, it would have been hard, I think, for any communist to swallow it if, let's say, you were in France and the Nazis were literally invading your homeland, and the party line is to collaborate. I find it amazing how many communists went along with that. But again, to be fair, not all of them did. A lot of them did finally tear up their party membership cards, as did some in the United States, although apparently not Pete Seeger.
Right. Let's talk about Mao a little bit because he's, one of the other great figures of this. And after World War II, in the Civil War in China, he emerges victorious. And what did Mao? How did he amend or revise or improve communism?
Well, I think there are definitely some important differences, not just with the kind of the fireworks stuff with the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward that we'll get to, but as far as the flavor, you might call it, of Asian communism, I think it mattered that, let's say, China was a non-European country, just in the sense that there was already a deep vein, a kind of very powerful vein of xenophobia or hesperophobia, that is to say, this fear and loathing and obviously resentment of the West, some of it for good reason, going back to the Opium Wars of the 19th century or the crushing of the Boxer Rebellion. You look at the Boxers, and to some extent, this is back in 1899, 1900, and then crushed by the Eight Power Expedition. There's already this kind of echo of we're being exploited by the European powers, later the communists call them capitalists, of course, but like, the Western or European powers, and we need to eradicate all of their influence. And the Kuomintang or the KMT under Chiang Kai-shek, which was initially actually supported by Stalin and the Soviet Union, even though they weren't necessarily orthodox or doctrinaire communists, they too had this element of a kind of an anti-Western, almost xenophobia that was part of their popular appeal. I mean, they had to make compromises in the end. Paradoxically, or perhaps you might say inevitably, China became probably even more dependent on Western capital than any before in the era of China's kind of ascendancy. But so Mao was definitely, I think, even if he was, loyal communist, absolutely on Moscow's payroll and all of that, he was also, I think, drawing on this native tradition where, it wasn't just that you were going to try to eradicate capitalism, but let's say, you were trying to get rid of all malign foreign influence. So, as early as 49, 50, and then it kind of ratchets up with the Korean War when, everything is kind of this anti-Americanism. It's really quite strong all through the 1950s. Just any hint of foreign influence has to be eradicated. And some of it, of course, because a lot of the foreigners had fled. They had fled with the nationalists. A lot of them went to Formosa or Taiwan. A lot of them ended up in Hong Kong. So there was this element too of like, oh, well, all those foreigners who have left are still conspiring with the ones who were behind. So we have foreign spies. There were elements of this in the Soviet Union too. I mean, there was a very strong xenophobic element in the Great Terror of the 30s as well, with the fear of neighboring powers, spies working on behalf of the Poles or the Germans or the Japanese. But so you'd have kind of this anti-Western, hesperophobic, xenophobic element, which was then added together with
How much,
the
and then
widespread.
that combines also to build. I mean, one of the things that's fascinating. This is true not only of Mao's China, but certainly of the 19th century emergence of countries like in their modern forms, Germany, Italy, and Japan, as well as the Soviet Union, of recreating themselves as a modern entity by making appeals back to uniquely, Roman or Teutonic or Chinese culture, right? So it becomes this interesting paradox of the way that you become a pure version of yourself is by kind of creating a genealogy that is nationalist, even oftentimes when you're talking, certainly in terms of the Soviet Union, in terms of internationalism, but somehow you become more, if not Russian, you become more an older version of yourself.
Right, and I think you could see some elements of that, but the problem which emerged during the Cultural Revolution, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, launched in 65, 66. The problem there was that although absolutely they're trying to purge the Western influence and the foreign influence and all the foreign devils, and there are even attacks on some of the foreign embassies. I mean, even the communist embassies of East Germany and the Soviet Union are attacked. That was all true, and there was a certain, you might call it almost like an inner logic to it. But it went so far that they were also attacking anything old, including old Chinese things and old Chinese books and old Chinese traditions. So even though they're mostly trying to eradicate Western influence, capitalism, etc., eventually it got to the point where it was even destructive of the native heritage. And I think that's what you saw particularly in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, almost the most extreme variation of this. You could take this hesperophobic anti-Western xenophobia to such an extreme degree that you ended up also eradicating your own cultural heritage, which is what happened in Cambodia. And that was in some ways really almost aside from obviously the mass death and suffering, almost the saddest thing of all is the utter destruction of kind of urban, modern, literate civilization of any kind, where it becomes almost this entirely negative phenomenon. Although curiously enough, again, I think you could see some elements of that, although some of it might have been peculiar again to the circumstances in Cambodia and China, you could see some of that even in Marx's writing. When he's trying to puzzle out what he thought communism was, and he's talking about things like the negation of the negation, it is this very oppositional sort of negative force. You're constantly trying to eradicate something. Again, at their best, at times they were trying to build things, and I think, crazy and disruptive as it was, at least under, let's say, I mean, I don't want to defend the Great Leap Forward because it was so murderous in implementation, but when it came to kind of like the industrialization drive, or we want to surpass the West, at least they're trying to build something. But with this element of the kind of the xenophobic, destruction and vengeance, it was such a primal negative force that, in the end, you would get these vast book burnings, which are just incredibly shocking, that you were seeing these things in China and in Cambodia. I mean, in Cambodia, when the Khmer Rouge poured into Phnom Penh, there weren't just book burnings. They were even basically throwing cash out the window and even burning money. And earlier on, you think like at least the Soviet communists realized they wanted to take the money out of the banks and use it to buy stuff. Now they're just burning the money. I mean, it's just almost purely nihilistic. So
Was
I think
there any appreciation for the idea that this, homegrown revolt that was even calling back to an earlier era of Cambodian history, the Khmer regime with Rouge, in French, et cetera, but that it It was simultaneously, a repudiation of Western influence, but also completely built on kind of Western ideals or ideas from Marx and other people.
Oh, it definitely was, and I mean, you could trace, the lineage of people like, Pol Pot, obviously studying in Paris, and then he's in China during the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, so you can see where the influences are coming from and where some of the ideas are coming from. Yes, they're coming in from the West, then, of course, refracted through the experience of China with the Red Guards and the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. I mean, you could see an analog, a very mild analog of this and what was happening in the West at the time, with the spirit of the Soissons-Litard, the 68, the kind of the student rebellion, the cult of youth. If you watch these old kind of Hollywood B movies from the era, there's this one, I can't remember the name of it, where it starts off with this kind of rebellion of the youth, and some opportunistic politicians start, kind of embracing teenagers, and then they
I
get a little
believe it's called
younger.
Wild in the Streets,
Oh, is that it? Right,
and
and eventually, like,
the
they outlaw
yes.
anyone over the age of 30 or something,
Yes.
I think,
Yes,
right?
that's right.
Yeah.
People over the age of 30 or 35 are put into concentration camps where
Yes.
they are just fed continuously a stream of LSD
Oh,
so that
right.
they shut up about it. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
It's available for free on YouTube.
Is that right?
Well worth watching. And I guess that part of my question, talking about Mao, is when people talked about being Maoists in the 60s and 70s, and and this was a large number of groups. I think the Weather Underground, the American terrorist organization, referred to themselves as Maoists. And Julia Kristeva, the Bulgarian-born French intellectual, talked about her. Everybody went through a Maoist phase. What did it mean to be a Maoist, in the West in the 70s?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I suppose you're right. To some extent, the life had sort of gone out of the Soviets as far as the glamour appeal. I mean, Khrushchev, after all, he had sort of called a spade a spade. He had actually denounced Stalin and all of his crimes, and so to some extent, you could no longer be completely naive about the failures of the Soviet Union. And then, of course, you get this increasingly geriatric Politburo, and the Soviets are kind of sclerotic and uninspiring. Whereas Mao, there's this kind of madcap energy again, for lack of a better word. I mean, he's staging these dramatic swims in the Yangtze River, even if, okay, I mean, he's mostly just floating downstream, but like there's this kind of cult of personality, there's this energy, there are these crazy goals, there are the Red Guards. I mean, I'm thinking, actually, we're talking about movies. You're probably familiar with that French Canadian movie, Les Invasions Barbares, came out
Yes,
about
the
20 years.
barbarian invasions.
Barbarian invasions, and
Yes.
I remember the scene from that movie that was just so striking, in this kind of, aging, overweight, not terribly inspiring professor, the one who's
Yeah.
dying, I guess, of cancer or something, and
Right.
his son, who's some type of a renegade bond trader who's,
Yeah.
betrayed his father's kind of crypto Marxist legacy by going off and working in the markets. But that's the only way he can get his
He
own room in a hospital. He gets like a
Yeah,
little
and
waiting
to get
cell.
the drugs to kill himself, actually.
Right, and
That's
they
like
get the
he
drugs
wants
to
to
kill
commit
himself, right.
suicide, but he can't
Yeah,
access the Canadian healthcare system to even
right.
kill himself, and so his bond trader son is helping him.
Yeah. But
But I
the
yeah,
scene that I remember, right, was when, he kind of had this right before he kills himself, he has this grandiose nostalgia fest with some of his old sort of, leftist intellectual comrades, and they all get together and they talk about the old days. And with a little bit of contrition, he remembers the time that some Chinese poet came to campus, and he was kind of telling her how inspiring it was, everything they're doing there under Mao and the great proletarian cultural revolution. And I love the fact that you guys are creating this new world. And the woman finally waits for him to shut up, and then she says, what is it? Both of my parents were murdered by Red Guards. And he just kind of finally shuts up about it. I mean,
yeah,
it's
and
it.
he in that monologue, he actually says something along the lines of like, "I was a Maoist, I was this, I was that," and
Yeah,
or "I believed in Maoism, this, that, and the other thing," and then he said
right.
ultimately, like, I believed in cretinism," or something.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
yeah, it's a an incredible kind of, litany of all of the, kind of left-wing fads that were incredibly violent. that the
And
first
it
thing
wasn't just
had
this
to mean.
dim-witted professor in some Canadian university, by the way. I'll give you a famous example, and this is not to impugn him in any way, but Stéphane Courtois, who is in some ways the most famous French historian of communism, he was the one who came up with the famous and now almost ubiquitously cited figure, at least by people who kind of are on this side of the political divide. A lot of other people think it was grotesque, of 100 million people being killed by communist regimes. He was a Maoist. Courtois, the editor of the Black Book of Communism, this famous compendium of crime. He was a Maoist in the late 60s and early 70s. I mean, it's something of a French tradition, the kind of the ex-communist memoir. I mean, nearly everyone, it seems like, in France, even some of the best. And I mean, of course, you could say that people like Whittaker Chambers in the United
Mhm.
States. I mean, a lot of the best critics of communism are those who are
Yeah.
themselves communists
John
because
Dos
they kind of
Passos, even people
right,
like, in a more half-hearted way, people like Richard Wright and
right.
the other contributors to, The God That Failed.
Yeah, I,
Let's
I I love that. I'm just sorry, but the
Yeah.
Richard Wright
Yeah.
thing. You remember Native Son, because although he also wrote a more formal essay about it in The God That Failed, but in Native Son, I always thought that was quite remarkable. The scene. It's not just the way the young African American is kind of manipulated by the kind of rich limousine liberal type communist activists who kind of recruit him into the movement. It's of course what he does to her because I mean in the end what does he do? He has because he accidentally kills her or something, and I think he then ends up you know burning the body in the
Yeah, and he
fireplace.
throws
Kind
her
of
down the incinerator shaft or
throws her
whatever,
down
and
the
yeah,
incinerator shaft. I thought that was great. Like that was his impression of communism after
yeah.
he had gotten to know the
Yeah,
movement.
there's a real
Yeah,
striking,
yeah.
scene in the second half of his, autobiography. The first one is Black Boy, which takes him through moving to Chicago from the Deep South. And this was a book that was published much later. I think it was even after he was dead, but there's a scene where he is literally walking the other direction through a Communist Party march because he's
Mm,
realized in a way that, somebody like Paul Robeson, to cite, another famous African American who never really broke with communism or with the Soviet Union, that Wright
right.
seemed to understand. And it's fascinating how people's, my background is in literary history, and it's amazing. Like the quickest thing you could do to lose your literary reputation in America in the post-war era was to actually say the Soviet Union was not all good.
Hmm.
And then suddenly, people like John Dos Passos went from being, one of the most acclaimed writers in the world to being a non-person, really, and ended up weirdly doing events for National Review by the end of his life. So
Hmm.
he kind of went all the way. Just in the interest of time, if we could talk a little bit about the Soviet, or rather international communism seemed to collapse starting in 1989. And there are events, and you talk about this in a way that I think is really interesting and important for the current moment, where in the spring of 1989 we have the Tiananmen Square demonstrations, and where Chinese students, and I mean this must have been a mind fuck to people who would have remembered the Cultural Revolution, but they occupy Tiananmen Square, they build a Statue of Liberty like figure for democracy, and they get crushed. And then later, in the year, the Berlin Wall collapses, the Baltic states revolt, and suddenly within a couple of years, the Soviet Union is kaput, and so is the communist countries of Eastern Europe. Can you talk a little bit about why did that happen when it did, and then how was China's response to the same forces that undermined the Soviet Union radically different?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, to begin with, I think China had one big advantage, which was that although now, of course, China is this colossus and arming in all directions, at least during the latter stages of the Cold War, China was not maintaining this vast empire of satellites and maintaining this kind of vast nuclear arsenal and trying to keep up with and surpass the Americans and effectively kind of manning this gargantuan military empire. The Soviets, in the end, they just had a lot more responsibilities, a lot more things they had to spend on.
They were
They
more of an empire.
Right, and I
right? Yeah.
still don't think though, and here is the thing, and I think, not everyone is necessarily agree with my interpretation, but I don't think the Soviets had to collapse when they did. There are a lot of reasons they did. I mean, there are a lot of reasons that the pressure, the Reagan arms buildup, the pressure on oil prices, the collapse of gold, all these kind of economic factors, the inflation. And people forget that Gorbachev, of course, didn't come to power in 1985 in order to surrender the Cold War. He was trying to accelerate. Uskorenia, that was the theme of the 12 5-year plan. They were trying to accelerate and surpass and beat the Americans as usual. And in a lot of arms categories, such as production of kind of tanks and nuclear submarines and artillery, they were actually beating the Americans in the late 1980s. The problem, of course, is that they're spending, by some reckoning, something like 80% of the economy is now devoted to the military-industrial complex. So the consumer sector is obviously incredibly weak. I still don't think, though, that it kind of had to collapse when it did. In a lot of ways, Gorbachev was just really inept. And, he really did kind of surrender the Cold War. I mean, to some extent, he surrendered it, and as some people said, for kind of Deutschmarks. And literally, I mean, the Germans just kind of bribed the Soviets to leave Germany. And he literally begged President Bush to give him $100 billion to surrender the Cold War. It's kind of amazing if you look at what was actually happening in 1990. Sure, there's a lot of
That's
pressure.
what a bargain, really.
I know. I
You
mean,
know?
in retrospect, we should have taken it. We absolutely should have
This
taken
is
it.
why he ended up being a Pizza Hut pitchman,
That's
right?
right.
Like he
Yeah,
really
yeah.
was not a very good businessman.
Yeah, and we shouldn't forget Louis Vuitton. I was actually it was I
Yeah,
remember I was teaching a class once about Gorbachev, and I was talking about the Pizza Hut thing, and the student passed across a copy of The
yeah,
Economist over the table, and there he was in the back cover. He's hawking Louis Vuitton luggage. But so why is it that China? Well, I mean, I think
yeah,
first of all, it's just I talk about the sword. Obviously, it's just here is the thing: is they showed in the end whether it was the new economic policy of the 20s, Deng Xiaoping's reforms of the 80s, or the crackdown in Tiananmen Square. They're different policies in some ways, but in the end, the goal is the same, and that is staying in power. The goal is staying in power by whatever means. It could be policy flexibility, a little bit of tolerating or encouraging Western foreign investment, special and economic zones. But if you need to, you crack down. And in the end, Gorbachev shied away from this. I talk about in some ways when, although they did crack down at times, and there was political violence in the Gorbachev years, in the end, he actually kind of raked his own generals, over the coals for some of these actions that he had himself ordered, which is kind of hypocritical and also self-defeating. And in the end, I think he really just kind of forfeited the support of
yeah.
of.
He
Also,
was not willing to go to the mattresses, right? At the
no,
end, yeah.
no, he
In a
wasn't.
way that the Chinese regime was willing to do so, and probably
Right.
could do so more easily in terms of Western people in general were not as invested in what happened after the Tiananmen Square cameras kind of went blank.
Yeah, and in the end, Gorbachev was vain enough to kind of care about his image in the West. The
Mhm.
irony there, of course, is that by courting Western loans, Western approval, and so on, he ended up ensuring that he would be utterly despised by the people of
Yeah,
Russia. But he did win Time Magazine Man of the Decade and all the rest of it.
yeah.
But
Well, that's
so
important.
it's important. I mean, so they
No,
stay
I'm
in power in China,
joking.
and
Yeah.
I think that in the end, what they figured out, it's not like they have some economic formula where they're now going to surpass the West in the way you always have these kind of boasts. Rather, they have figured out what to do to stay in power, and so it's going to be. It's not always the same formula. At times it's a little more repression. At times it's a little more surveillance. At times, I mean, these days it's kind of more of an all-pervasive social credit and surveillance system. The slightly disturbing thing about this is that, of course, we've discovered there are varieties of this kind of overtaking the West now. That is to say, while there isn't any government, I think, that is threatening this. Well, I don't know. There was definitely a lot of shutting down of private businesses in the COVID era. They didn't necessarily seize and nationalize them all, but there was definitely a lot of shutting down of private enterprise. But that kind of ubiquitous kind of social surveillance and social credit system, and I mean, even the old bright red denunciation boxes they had in Mao's China. I mean, we kind of have this now with various kind of cancel and snitching campaigns. Again, we have varieties of it, I think, in the
Yeah,
West, and
let's
it's
talk
being
about that because that, as we started this conversation, you end To Overthrow the World with the line, "Far from dead, communism as a governing template seems only to be getting started." And that, when we think about like pure communist countries, where we're kind of down to Cuba, maybe, North Korea for sure, Cuba, Venezuela, China, yes, but it's it's such a hybrid mix now. It may be approaching the US, especially if the US or,
Mm.
Canada and the EU keep going more and more like as a kind of state sanctioned capitalism. But then in a piece last fall for the American Conservative, you wrote that the creed of the commissar lives on, and that I think in that piece as well, you talked about what used to be discussed as the peace dividend after the Cold War ended. And George H.W. Bush, to his credit, and Bill Clinton continued this. They said, okay, we can actually draw down. We don't have to spend as much money on defense, and defense spending did go down. But you note that since then, Washington has tripled down on statism and in NATO and in forever wars. So you're kind of arguing that communism is not dead or even dormant, but that it has changed to a different format where it's starting to, kind of be taken up in the West. And to add to this, you've talked about social credit systems in China are one thing where it's kind of state directed, but that social media in America, and certainly we see this with things like the Twitter files and the Facebook files, where these social media companies were heavily embed with the government on what kind of information went forward, who had an account, who didn't, who got prioritized. Are you seriously arguing that we're seeing a kind of efflorescence of communistic practices in America, in here in 2025?
Well, I suppose one could always object and say that by some formal dictionary definition, communism requires state ownership of the means of production,
Right.
and so whatever we have is not that. I do think, though, it's important to recognize that even in the heyday of Stalinism or Maoism,
Yeah.
the state never owned all of the means of
Yeah,
production.
which is amazing. It
Yeah,
is really stunning. Yeah.
yeah, it's more aspirational than real, and I do think, and I suppose this is one might say I'm kind of splitting hairs, but I do think that the definition of what communism is, at least as it is now practiced in, let's say, China, is a bit different. It doesn't require the state ownership of all of the means of production. Rather, the state can still kind of pick and choose winners and losers, manipulate, control the economy, surveil the population, single party rule. I mean, maybe the closest you might say we have to this, and we're dealing with something like this with the wildfires in California, is you have something like a single party government. And to some extent in California, it's even more so. But I mean, to some extent, in Washington, I think it's interesting because now, of course, you have maybe this kind of regime change that may or may not be coming in some dramatic way, with the Trump people. But the difference when, let's say, the Democrats are in power in Washington, the main difference is just that the permanent bureaucracy is generally speaking aligned with the Democrats. And so when the Democrats are in power, it's kind of like it works like a machine almost. I think, the Trump people are going to come over, they're going to try to take it over, and they're actually going to have some difficulty achieving whatever their goals are, in part because there's this kind of tension. Whereas the natural, you might say, almost evolution of the permanent bureaucracy in Washington is not, again, it's not Stalinism exactly, but rather it is in this direction of just increasing state kind of intervention and surveillance and control and choosing winners and losers and
No, and I mean, as we're
targeting.
talking again, this will come out after this, but as we are talking, we're waiting to see whether or not the Supreme Court agrees that the US government can tell TikTok, the US
Mm,
version of TikTok, like, you're gone.
right.
Like, you either have to sell to somebody that the government approves of or you're finished. Which is kind of stunning, and in a way, I'm a good libertarian, so I'm, always apoplectic about something, but it's kind of stunning that there isn't more outrage about the idea that a company which has, been shown to cause no national security harms or risks is being told, like, you either sell or go out of business. And the government, and this is, has been ratcheting up, for decades now, but especially in the 2020s, the federal government is reliably spending 25% of GDP. These are like, 5 points or more above historic highs for most of the 20th century. So there is something about the expanding state, I think, where, the analogy, and I don't even want to say the analogy. I mean, what's interesting is to think about is what does it mean to say that the government is regulating more and controlling more, which seems to be, unquestionable, but we also have more modes of freedom and expression and capital accumulation.
Yeah,
So if
there is
yeah,
something of a paradox there. I mean, you look at the internet, and obviously we all
mhm,
had this kind of rush of almost euphoria back in the
yep.
90s. We all
You
thought that
were you
this
were an undergrad at Stanford in the
I was,
90s,
so I
right? Yeah.
experienced a
So
lot of that
yeah,
atmosphere. A lot of my friends would go to work for Oracle or Google or
yeah.
Excite or Yahoo. So there was this idea, like we're gonna free everything, free
Yeah.
communication, free the media,
No, we're
free
freeing the human body. I mean, like we're
right.
going to move up into, it wasn't called the cloud then, but into, we were going to migrate to cyberspace, right?
Right, whereas maybe we should have paid attention to the origins of the internet, of course, which was in the Pentagon, in the end, both the kind of the origins, and you might say the final, at least sort of evolution of it, and it's not necessarily final because obviously people can push back against this, is it actually enables a greater degree of surveillance than ever before. I mean, like if you look at the Soviet collapse we've talked about before, had the Soviets had these tools at their disposal that we now have, they wouldn't have had to spend so much on human spying and torture and surveillance and all the rest of it. They would have been able to know what people were thinking at almost all times, and they could have channeled public opinion, even more sort of
Yeah.
effectively.
Although in
These
a
these
in a
tools,
way, yeah, I mean, I think in a way your basic argument in To Overthrow the World is kind of strong, which is that they knew what they had to do to stay in power, and
yeah,
their leaders did not, thankfully for, well, I mean,
thankfully.
it's complicated, but because I was going to say thankfully for the former Soviet, people living in former Soviet countries, they didn't have the guts to just kill more people in order to stay in power like China did. But isn't, I mean, in the end, we can talk about technology, but political violence requires, like, actually mashing, flesh and blood, right?
Well, I think so, and I think we have to be thankful both that in the end, as you pointed out, the Soviet leaders did back down, and Gorbachev, although he did shed blood, refrained from maybe shedding more blood, and that so far, even though the permanent bureaucracy in Washington or in like a one-party state such as California, that well, there are things that they could be doing to ensure basically that they will stay in power forever, and maybe they're trying to do that, but so far I think we have to take it as a small mercy that they have not been successful enough in order to do that. But I do think it's just, unfortunately, it's just kind of human nature. There's always going to be this temptation to control, to surveil, to use power, to seize power, to hold on to power. There are always going to be these power hungry people. And so I just think we have to be eternally vigilant to
So
protect our
two
civilities.
two final questions, if we can get to them. The first is, how do your students respond to this? I'm curious. You've been teaching now for what, about 20 years?
Yeah, about 20 years. Mhm.
Yeah, and have you noticed a marked change over time? Then I realize these are all small samples, et cetera, but one, are students less interested in the period you're talking about? Because, I was born in 1963, so I'm like a late boomer. The Cold War and the war, communism versus free enterprise was kind of the whole world. And like everything else kind of came out of that, including cultural identities and, so many, big and small petty alliances and things like that. Are younger people still interested in this era? And, does your kind of evocation of it, does it capture their imagination?
I think fewer certainly now than there would have been in the I didn't teach in the '80s, so I can't really speak with any experience there. But 20 years ago, I think there was still a little bit more of this lingering interest in the Cold War and the Soviet Union. I think now it does strike a lot more of the young people, if they even think about it at all. It's just kind of ancient history. I mean, some of them I can still turn them on to the subject, almost by introducing it to them because it's almost new to them. It's just not something that was really kind of part of their consciousness growing up. I mean, some of them, are just discovering Marx and Lenin, and of course, a lot of them are discovering it in a way where they want to become Marxists or Leninists. And I usually do try, obviously, to push back a little bit. I don't try to tell them what to think, but I try to let them know, these are the things that they wrote, said, and did. Um, and you should be aware of kind of the
Did the
consequences.
Occupy movement reinvigorate a kind of Marxist or communist sensibility in a way that it was where the bad parts were kind of wiped out. I'm thinking, and this is a kind of insane leap, but from the Occupy movement, which seemed to, it flowered and then it seemed to die, and disappear. But in fact, we're still using the language of the 1%. When you see something like Luigi Mangione, who's become
Mm.
kind of a social media superstar, it seems very much a kind of epiphenomenon of Occupy or a long term form. How did the students respond to that? And are they interested in a kind of communism without bloodshed or?
Well, it's a good question. When I first returned to teach in the US in 2014, I had been teaching in Turkey for many years. Definitely, you could still feel the breath of kind of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And, it was also right before the first Bernie Sanders run for president. So there was kind of groundswell of almost a more class focused um, left kind of orientation, which was interesting because in some ways it was a little more old fashioned, and it was actually nice to some extent, even if I didn't necessarily agree with all their views, to see students actually taking economics seriously, even if they were reducing it somewhat simplistically. At least they were thinking about economics. A lot of that I think got washed away with identity politics,
Yeah.
intersectionality, and all
Oh,
the
for sure. And even by
yeah,
Bernie Sanders, he
right.
kind of declassified himself and became much more of an identity politics
He
guy
did.
in a
Yeah.
way that was, I'm a free market libertarian, but I was disappointed when, I mean, he was the main guy talking about class in American politics and culture, where it really rarely gets discussed. And so I think he's getting back on that train.
Yeah, I think he is, and you're right. We might be seeing a kind of a resurgence of this now. And I mean, maybe again, this is just the vagaries of politics that now that at least some billionaires have kind of switched
Yeah,
sides and now they're on the Trump train, now
right.
you're going to get this kind of left critique of, the kind
Yeah.
of the billionaire
So every
capitalist
billionaire is a
quality of
policy
it.
failure.
Right.
Yeah.
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 It was fine when, people like Soros were supporting
Right.
politicians. But now billionaires are bad again. So I
That's
think you're
right.
right. You will get a little bit of a kind of a resurgence of and I mean maybe I mean frankly what Soros was largely spending money on, of course, was a lot, not all of it, but a lot of it was that identity politics stuff, which was kind of obscuring the
Yeah.
class issues. So
Although
now in
it's
some ways,
fascinating in Europe, the open society institutions that he funded were really talking about, actual political, like individual political freedom. So it's
yeah, oh, back in the 90s,
yeah,
that was definitely
yeah,
true. That was
yeah,
definitely true. A lot more sort of, you might say, productive uses. Even at times, they would be, giving money out for kind of Xerox copiers for helping the
yeah.
subs out and those kinds of things. A lot of what the Soros organization funded back then, I wouldn't call it class focused exactly, but, definitely
No,
focused, on pluralism. Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, you bring up the billionaires who are backing Trump, and one of the things that is interesting between 2016 and 2020 and this past election, is that Silicon Valley, like high profile Silicon Valley tech billionaires, have kind of rolled with Trump this time, particularly Elon Musk. Do you think you a lot of people are interpreting this as, okay, we've had 15 years of kind of real high charged identity politics, wokeism, suppression of speech, even less, not maybe not legally, but internally, like where we've all, kind of, we censored ourselves because we didn't want to lose our social media standing, et cetera, and things like that, that's all over now. Do you think that is true, or do you think that Trump is going to usher in an era of a kind of equal but opposite ideological use of the apparatus of the state in the ways that you were worried about, and in terms of social media, when you have people like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, really kind of saying, "Oh yeah, I'm for free speech and I'm with Donald Trump." Is this liberation, or is this just kind of shifting from Lenin to Stalin in a very watered down way?
Well, yeah, you mentioned Zuckerberg. I think Mark Andreessen's another interesting
Yeah,
example of
yeah,
this, where I think both he and Zuckerberg had a little bit of a kind of a scary moment, with the government, according again what they said, just really, really just hot breath of kind of we want you to control this and censor this. And a lot of it was obviously COVID related, but you have to kind of clamp down on this message. You have to censor this. You're not allowing those voices. And we now know how many voices were silenced or censored from things like YouTube and about the Twitter files and all of this. No, I think some of it is this genuine revulsion at what happened over the past several years. Some of it's probably self-interested, one assumes. It's going to be, look, this is the new regime. And so, we need to kind of make nice with the new regime. I certainly hope in a positive sense. There does seem to have been a genuine backlash against the more overt status style censorship and repression. There's obviously a danger that a different type of, repression might reemerge in the Trump era, whether you're talking about social media or the media more generally or more broadly. I do think that we may have dodged a bullet, though. I do feel like things were trending in a very kind of a dark way for a couple of years. And it's not that we're out of the woods necessarily, but, I do, if you look at what's happening in Britain, with people being kind of arrested over social media posts and, all this kind of thing people have been talking about over the past few months, or, in Europe with, elections being canceled, when they don't like the result of elections. It's kind of shocking, what's happening in the European Union, or, people. It's funny, they'll accuse Musk because he's a billionaire of intervening in their politics. What exactly did he do? He interviewed someone, or he made a tweet. It's kind of like, what exactly has he done to intervene in your elections? Okay, you might not like it, but I think he has the right to speak. You could say, like, if he's manipulating algorithms on Twitter, that's maybe a different question. But if it's just him expressing his own personal viewpoint, I don't know how that is necessarily, eroding someone's freedom. But because he's so rich and he's so powerful and he's so influential, I think it's natural that people are skeptical. But anyway, I don't think we're out of the woods. I think there are definitely a lot of things still to be very concerned about regarding civil liberties and kind of statist trampling on our essential freedoms. I do think we might have dodged a bullet, and I don't think we're out of the woods yet. But
And when you say dodged a bullet, what do you think would have happened had Harris and a kind of Democratic majority maintained control of Washington?
Well, I don't know everything that would have happened, but I think one of the things that's pretty obvious that would have happened based on, what a lot of people have said is, I think Trump would be in jail. I think Elon Musk would be, if not in jail, then at the very least, I think a lot of his contracts would have been canceled. He'd be kind of tied up in various lawsuits. And I think eventually he might have lost control of X, or, it might have just been, it might have been nationalized, or at the very least, put under some type of receivership. The talk about, what needed to be done to Musk was quite overt last, I think, kind of August and September. There was all kinds of talk of retaliation, and Musk, he went all in. There's no doubt he threw in with Trump, and I think Trump would have ended up in jail, and I think Musk might have ended up in jail with him. And that doesn't mean that freedom for everyone would have necessarily been snuffed out, but I do think that X has emerged as one of the few platforms when people say it's now a right-wing thing. I don't think that's true at all. I think if you actually look at the political orientation of the users, I think it's actually one of the more equally balanced media out there. From what
which oftentimes gets interpreted as being right-wing, right?
Right.
If it's actually more of a distribution. I share many of your concerns, going forward, because, and I guess this is a final question. If more and more of the means of communication, not of production, but the means of communication, are in the hands of people who seem to be very politically motivated. And this is not new. The all of the broadcast networks in the mass media era, all had political investments that they kept, very much under wraps, but they were there. But now, is that problematic? And is looking back at history, is the best that we can hope for is that there is a constant shifting between whoever owns the means of communication, that their political commitments or ideological commitments are constantly shifting, or their ownership is shifting? Or is there a way to get beyond that, where the means of communication are more wide open, where we're not constrained by who owns, back in the day, CBS, and now who owns Twitter or Facebook?
Well, I suppose maybe it was more consolidated back in the Cold War era when you only had a few television stations, and so the message was presumably more easily coordinated. I do think, though, remarkably, that it seems like things actually got worse in the few decades after the Cold War. With basically the Washington Post or the New York Times or CNN becoming almost mouthpieces for the State Department, the CIA, the FBI, with this kind of cross pollination. And they're just literally with former spooks and spies who became correspondents, who are just, basically,
Yeah,
I mean, that article that you mentioned earlier, I was just amazed that Wired magazine seems to be doing sort of like PR for the Pentagon now, kind of
right.
boasting about the drone swarms they're going to use in the Taiwan Strait and all of this other stuff. And we think nothing now of these kind of former directors
And
of the
weirdly
CIA.
too, Wired is now more coded left.
Mhm.
In the 90s, it was,
Yeah,
kind of libertarian and kind of maybe rightist on some level. They had Newt
yeah.
Gingrich on the cover and whatnot. So it's even weirder that they're doing, complete promo work for the Pentagon or the deep state, and they are seen as left or liberal or progressive.
Yeah, I mean, maybe some of this is just that in the course of the Cold War, inevitably, and this happens in a lot of conflicts, we came increasingly to resemble our enemies. I mean,
Right.
you had this vast Pentagon bureaucracy and these vast statist kind of projects from
Yeah.
ARPANET to all kinds of
Oh,
varieties.
and I mean, for me, it was always when Cuba and the Soviet Union were banning rock records, people
Mm.
in the South were burning Beatles records or,
Sure.
or things like
Yeah,
yeah, there's that,
we're supposed to be better than
yeah,
that, right? We're supposed to be
yeah.
better than that. Yeah.
So, just final point then, are you, do you feel optimistic about what goes forward, or how do you, what are the mileposts? We have people, who are kind of ridiculous, very prominent historians who are constantly talking about how we are now on the 15th milestone of the 10 milestones towards utter fascism. You have that going on, but what do you look for to see, like, whether or not, communism is gaining ground or losing ground as a kind of loose term of the world that we live in?
Well, I think I said earlier I thought we dodged a certain bullet, but I don't think we're out of the woods. I just think we always, whatever party is in power in Washington, I think we always have to jealously guard our civil liberties, and we have to just constantly remind ourselves of what our values are and are supposed to be. So I mean, I would say, I suppose, guardedly optimistic that we might have avoided one possible bad outcome, but that doesn't mean that we're necessarily out of the woods.
All right. Well, I'll look forward to seeing you in one of those wild in the streets concentration camps because you're over 35, I'm over 35, and we'll just hang out and trip all day.
All right. Well, thanks for having me on, Nick.
Yeah. The book is To Overthrow the World: The Rise and Fall and Rise of Communism by Sean McMeekin. Thanks so much for talking.
Thanks, Nick.